flag-raising ceremony steeped in tradition as Beijing marks the 72nd anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo, and this is The Heat. October 1st marks the official start of National Day in China, a time for celebration, shopping and patriotism. A large crowd gathered at sunrise in Beijing's Tiananmen Square to witness the flag-raising ceremony. The Guard of Honor of the Chinese People's Liberation Army conducted the ceremony, followed by the national anthem played by the military band. National Day is celebrated in Chinese mainland, Hong Kong and Macau. This is also a very big week for tourism. Millions are expected to travel over the holiday to reunite with loved ones. Well, for more now on China's National Day, let's bring in our panel. Josef Gregory Mahoney is a professor of politics and the director of the International Graduate Program in Politics at East China Normal University. Ryan Patel is a global business executive and senior fellow with the Drucker School of Management at Claremont Graduate University in California. Chen Chenchen is a development economist and CGTN commentator. And Shinde Xu is a senior fellow at the Pangol Institution and host of CGTN's Dialogue Weekend. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And Shinde Xu, let me start with you. Thousands of people gathered in Tiananmen Square at sunrise to watch this flag-raising ceremony, which will mark the 72nd anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. So give us a sense of what this means, the significance of this for China and the Chinese people.
Well, this is a time, just like in every year, people would spend the 7-day National Day holiday. It's rather long, and people go to other cities, to enjoy the sightseeing, to enjoy some, break from the work. And of course, it's a time for people to go shopping, to see the movie. And in Beijing, in particular, of course, people will get up really early to witness the flag-raising ceremony. It's like a ritual to show respect to the nation at this particular time. So in general, this is a happy time, full of joy, full of expectation. Whether you are meeting friends, whether you are, planning to visit another city, or going to see a new movie, etc. This is a great time for, as you pointed out, a great time for tourism, for traveling, for meeting your friends, to relax, to have a break. So yes, a good time to celebrate and enjoy.
Chen Chenchen, of course, it's a big week for tourism, as we just heard. It lasts a week, and according to one estimate, there's something like 127 million people who will be traveling across the country by rail. So what does this mean in China for tourism? And given that, we still have the pandemic, what does all this travel tell us about the resilience of the Chinese economy?
Well, the consumption during the Golden Week holiday indeed is a very interesting barometer to watch, to observe the Chinese economy. Actually, if you look at the statistics of expectation by some travel agents, it's expected that this year, up to 600 million people will travel during this Golden Week, which is a largely equivalent number if you compare to last year's number. But this year's Golden Week is 1 day less. And also this year, the cross-provincial travel is almost totally back on track. So only the northeastern Heilongjiang province and southeastern Fujian province, they remain middle and highly risky COVID regions. This means in most of the transportation lines and hubs, they will not be affected by the COVID. So in the enterprises, if you look at their expectations from the service industry, typically the tourism, the film industry, the hotels, shopping malls, they are also holding high expectations because the statistics in the just ended the Moon Festival holiday, 3-day holiday in September was very promising. Some of the regions, the number of reception of tourists were even back to the level of pre-COVID period, back to the level of 2019. Some of the regions like in Ningxia, autonomous region, the number was almost 50% up. So from a more generally more macro view, you can see the confidence picked up by the enterprises. The total growth trend of the total retail sales of consumer goods, that also stimulates the confidence of service industries.
Josef Gregory Mahoney, there are still a few isolated cases of COVID-19 across China. In fact, looking at all this travel that we've been talking about, the Ministry of Culture and Tourism has put restrictions in place for travelers who are moving across China. But from a public health point of view, has the Chinese government largely brought the COVID-19 pandemic under control?
It has. In fact, the pandemic in China was brought under control last year. And this is one of the reasons why China is the world leader now for inbound FDI. And we should note two additional points here. First, when China responded to the outbreak in 2019, it was the first country to do so, and it had the extreme disadvantage of confronting an unknown pathogen and was initially flying blind. Now, when this was understood, it communicated its findings globally and gave other countries time to prepare. And yet, with the possible exception of New Zealand, a small island nation far away from others that quickly sealed its borders, no other countries outperformed China in containment. Second, about 78% of the Chinese population has now received 2 doses of vaccine, and China is also either the only or one of the only countries to control the Delta variant. Consequently, we have to say that China's containment efforts have been an extraordinary success, that this has been good for the Chinese people, and that it has had tremendous carryover effects for global health and economic well-being.
Joseph, as you say, there's been enormous success on the part of the Chinese government in bringing this under control, in managing this. But do you still see mitigation efforts or mitigation measures still in place in the country?
We do, and one of the things that I, as a professor at a Chinese university, whenever we see a little outbreak happen because the virus has slipped a containment or quarantine, as we saw recently in Fujian, we get messages through WeChat that if we travel to those areas, that we have to get nucleic test. We have to self-quarantine before we can re-enter campus. We have to show the test in order to enter campus. So all of these things, in these areas where we do see these little outbreaks, we see quick containment efforts, and then really good communication in other areas that warn people about the travel, to restrict unnecessary travel, and if they do need to travel, to restrict how they interact when they return.
Ryan, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, he spoke at a reception at the Great Hall of the People to mark the anniversary. And in that address, Premier Li said reform and opening up is China's basic policy and the fundamental driving force for development. This, of course, has been a point that's been debated a lot, especially in the discussions with the United States. But what is your assessment of the progress made so far in opening up the Chinese economy to the world?
Well, I mean, if you think of where the Chinese economy was 2 decades or 3 decades ago to now, I mean, if you look at the sheer numbers, just sheer numbers, you take the names and everything out of it, it's a huge success. I think many countries would want those numbers, and I think has gotten there faster than most would anticipate it, and maybe even China as well. I mean, you think about how evolved the economy has become, not just from agriculture to technology to manufacturing, and obviously investments. It becomes very fascinating because when you take a day like this and you kind of reflect and see how far the economy goes, my mind immediately goes, what's next, right? And I think that is the next aspect of that they're going to have to evolve further to continue to stay at the top. And obviously that means the openness, the national conversations have to exist even more than before because they can't just do it by themselves. And also they need to build the rest of the global economy together to grow. And I think that's going to be a theme for the rest of China's growth to continue to grow, is to do that.
So, Ryan, where do you think China is going next?
Well, besides keep trying to go forward, I think they're going to lead the infrastructure spending in some of these other places that they can continue to be more trade partners with. We've seen the investments in China and Africa, obviously in Southeast Asia. To me, that makes a lot of sense to be able to provide output. I also think where China's next is providing goods and investments back into China, right? And being able to not just from a food perspective, but take advantages and leverage the employee power, the consumer power that they have built, right? And that hadn't always been the case. Just because you have sheer numbers doesn't necessarily mean that you can leverage that. And I think they've built an economy that is a lot more sophisticated than obviously a couple decades ago.
Shu, one of the questions that we often hear here in the United States is, when will life get back to normal? When will people be able to go out, go to restaurants, go to movies, travel around in relative freedom? But if you look at China, I was looking at one metric here, and that is 13 movies were released just this week. You mentioned that earlier on. It's known as National Golden Week. That's the highest number of movies released in 1 week. What does this tell us? Is life more or less got back to normal in China post-pandemic, if we look at just the movie-going public going to theaters this week?
That is the case, actually. And then if you look at the passenger trips, for example, we are expecting 650 million passenger trips to be made during the 7-day holiday. Basically, that represents a recovery of more than 80% of the same time in 2019, before the pandemic. It's, we are not saying it's a full recovery of the tourism here in China, but as you said, if you check the movie release, and the people are going to the number of people going to watch the movies, probably later on we'll have the number that would be more or less the same, because in absolute number of the cities, situation basically it's like normal. People meet friends, have a dinner in a restaurant, go shopping, seeing the movie. There's a still lingering concern, I would say, but in general, people are very confident. Things will be fine. Things are all right. Even in the mini outbreaks, so like in Harbin, in northeastern part of China, and Fujian, basically now it's like a 3. I think in Xiamen, only 3 in the Fujian entire province. And in Harbin, I think it's 11. So the latest number. So it's coming down, even regionally. I think most importantly is that people have the confidence, even there's outbreak, that outbreak will be contained very soon. Usually it's about a few weeks and then it's coming down. But of course, we are talking about whether China will be fully open, or at which point China will be fully open to the outside world in terms of the pandemic. Those measures will be somehow lifted. I think the strategy is, as Professor Mahoney mentioned, it's almost 80% of the vaccination rate, and for those older than 60 or with underlying conditions, medical workers, they are receiving the booster vaccination, but the general public is yet to receive a booster vaccination. I would say probably with the 3rd booster vaccine being administered, the country probably will be more ready, I would say, to open the borders, and then things could return to normal as we understand, internationally or globally.
Well, Shu, what about day-to-day life? I mean, say in a city like Beijing, where you are right now, when you go out, when you go out shopping, or take the subway, or go to the movies, or meet your friends and things like that, I mean, are there still a lot of people wearing masks? Are there still a lot of people practicing some kind of social distancing?
Social distancing, yes. It's not that strict, but usually if you go to a public place like a shopping mall, you will be required, obviously, to put on a mask, and also you have temperature checked. So that's the standard procedure wherever you go. But that's all. When you inside the restaurant, you meet your friend, you talk to each other, enjoying the food, just like normal, or watch a movie, or bookstore, or just go shopping. And you don't feel like anything special or different from the time before the pandemic, let's say. But if you are taking a subway, if you are in a bus, still you will have your mask on, basically 100%. All of people will do that. That's just a part of the daily business, and the people are getting used to that. So because the autumn is here, the winter is coming very soon in northern China in particular. So that's a time also a lot of people will use masks to prevent the flu, for example. So anyway, people just see it as a part of the daily life, and nothing really special. So besides that, people will say everything is normal. You just travel within the city to meet your friend, to go out or to go to work. That's it.
Chen Chenchen, I want to talk a little bit more about the Chinese economy. There was a report published by Bloomberg which said that China's economic momentum was stable in September, but domestic spending was weak because of COVID-19 restrictions on the housing market. So what is your assessment of how the Chinese economy is doing right now? And do you think it is still on track, on target to meet what many analysts believe should be a 6% growth rate by the end of 2021?
Domestic consumption is indeed a very interesting, very vivid window to look at Chinese economy. If you look at the numbers of total retail sales of consumer goods, the growth rate, they indeed slowed down in this summer because of the eruption of COVID cases in some regions and also the tightening measures in the housing market. But generally speaking, if you look at from a yearly basis, actually the growth momentum is expected to pick up in October and throughout the fourth quarter. So if you look at the whole number, actually, they will, compared with last year, will still grow by almost 12%. And if you look at the compared with the pre-COVID era, compared with 2019, the total retail sales of consumer goods, they will grow by about 8%. With that said, there are still problems in the Chinese economy that needs to draw our attention, because nowadays everybody is talking about the three driving forces for Chinese economy: investment, export, and consumption. But if you look at the biggest share, which part is contributing most, it's the domestic spending. In the first half, it contributed more than 60%, but that number is still relatively low compared to advanced economies, which the number was more than 80%. For Chinese economy, the investment can be stimulated by policy incentives in the short term. The exports, they really depend on the international environment. So it leaves the policymakers with very limited choices to really stimulate the domestic spending. So I think generally speaking, for the Chinese policymakers, they really need to work on how to continue expand employment and also how to guarantee the stable expansion of disposable resident income. That's going to be the strong driving force for the resilience of Chinese economy.
Josef Gregory Mahoney, let's talk about the other big issue, the other big challenge that is preoccupying the world and is very, very high up on the Chinese agenda, and that is, of course, the battle against climate change. In his address to the United Nations General Assembly last week, President Xi Jinping announced that China will stop financing coal-fired power plants abroad in projects that it's involved in outside of China in other countries. And he also said that China is committed to peaking CO2 emissions by 2030 and achieving carbon neutrality by 2060. What does this tell us about China's climate change strategy and its outlook for the future?
Well, you know, as someone who's lived in China for more than a decade and conducted research in many different parts of the country, I can tell you that cleaning up the environment became an effective priority for government shortly after the current generation of leadership took power in 2012, such that it's clear, I think, to many living in China that they are witnessing a green revolution. Now, data supports this. Last year, for example, cities at the prefecture level and above enjoyed 87% of their days with good or excellent air quality, and there have been significant improvements in ground and surface water. 90% of polluted farmland and 93% of polluted land plots have been rendered safe. We've seen new green belts built in urban areas, along with increasing usage of electric cars and other green forms of energy and associated innovations, with China now a leader in these fields. So the main challenge presently is keeping pace with growing energy demands, as we've seen most recently with concerns in China's northeast. But these appear manageable without reverting to dirtier habits.
You know, the point you mentioned about energy, energy demand at this time is outstripping supply, isn't it? I mean, how serious is that problem?
You know, for me personally, I hear a lot of different estimates, and a lot of people say that technological innovation can outpace. I'm not completely sure that's the case. One of the things that we see, for example, is that China is the world leader right now in increasing access to 5G. And one of the difficult things about 5G from what I understand, given a tour at Huawei a couple of years ago, is that it produces an exponential increase in energy demand. That as you're pushing more data, you need more energy. So it is a serious concern. And as China continues to grow its economy, it's going to be something that really needs to be managed. But given the tremendous investments that we're seeing, given the structural changes, given even things like putting in place the Beijing Stock Exchange with the ambition of creating access to capital for these firms that are at the forefront of innovation and green development, I think these are clear signals that the center is recognizing this challenge and moving aggressively to address it.
Ryan, October will mark 50 years since China took resumed its seat at the United Nations. In fact, to mark that event, the State Councilor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi talked about it. He said China will always champion the interests of the developing world, other developing countries, and support the concept of multilateralism. I mean, how significant is China's voice at the UN, especially for developing countries?
Well, I mean, it's important because it's, in essence, if you think about win-win situations, I mean, China is obviously in a really much better space than they were to be able to provide resources to the developing countries, right? And have a wide range of it as well. And let's not forget, and having capital to do so. And so when you have the ease of doing business and the resources and the partnership to provide income to many of these developing nations, where you can get things either much cheaper or have part labor or increase their GDP, that's a win-win, right? And so that their ability to be involved in those conversations, their ability to strike, I don't want to say deals, but strike where opportunities exist to help. What they're offering will be the shiniest thing on the table for many of these developed or up and coming developing nations for their goals to reach there.
Shideshu, of course, China has been deeply involved in the UN system, and if you look at its involvement in peacekeeping operations, for instance, poverty alleviation, climate change, and more recently, of course, in the battle against COVID-19. What would you say has been China's biggest accomplishment in global governance, especially at the UN?
Well, at the UN, for China, UN is probably the most representative international body in terms of the rules-based international order. Because that's the body deserves the respect from every country as members of this international organization. Basically was established after the Second World War. It represents every country and represents a manner of cooperation in terms of discussing and deliberating and cooperating with each other. Yes, China is playing a more and more important role. For example, in terms of contribution to the UN operation fee, it comes the second after the US. And also in terms of this peacekeeping operation, it provides the largest number of peacekeepers among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. So it is also, again, after the US, it's the second contributor in terms of this operation fees there. So as China develops growth in terms of economy, it increases contribution to the operation of the UN. And it is making the contribution in other aspects too, as we say, in terms of the international organizations, multinational institutions. For example, you have the AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, as a kind of like I would say addition to the existing institutions, financial institutions like World Bank, International Monetary Fund, like Asia Development Bank. So you have different banks investing in infrastructures to help the developing countries, in particular, to develop their economy and to unleash the potentials. That's sort of a role China is playing, I would say increasingly playing in that position.
Chen Chenchen, as China marks the 72nd anniversary of its founding, we're also seeing the tensions between the United States and China getting to new levels. I mean, if you just look at the last few months, there's more pressure now against Chinese companies, tech companies like Huawei, and we've just heard the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom announce this new security pact known as AUKUS. How does China respond to these?
Well, the trade frictions, the trade tensions between China and the United States is not going to go away anytime soon because it's a structural problem between existing power and an emerging power. But the essence behind this superficial symptom of trade is really the competition of industrial policies, how these different powers, China, United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, they themselves build their economy domestically and try to climb up the global industrial chain and try to seek dominance at different ends, the lower end, middle end, and higher ends of this global industrial chain. And for China, I think it is really focusing on two things. First is try to stimulate its domestic demand, and second is try to boost its domestic independent innovation. Because since reform had opened up, China has been relying a lot on technological transfer. So nowadays, how it's going to boost its own development and innovation, that's going to be a real challenge.
Okay. Josef Mahoney, very quickly, we've just got about a minute left. I mean, when we look at these trade tensions between the United States and China, there seems to be mixed messages coming out. On the one hand, we hear these very hawkish statements coming from American politicians, from the White House administration here, etc. But we just had a report come out of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, which said that American firms have never been more confident about their business prospects in China. I mean, how does one explain this?
You know, I think we see from U.S. investors and firms tremendous confidence in China, signified by the surging FDI and supported by published analyses from leading investment firms that view China's containment success, reforms and development plans, current growth rates, per capita GDP, population of 400 million middle-income earners and growing, as offering perhaps the best market for business globally. But I think this point is best explained with a little anecdote. Both this year and last year, I was approached by several business leaders who were enthusiastic about Trump's trade war with China, but wanted advice on how to invest their U.S. government-supported COVID stimulus payments in Chinese growth funds. Now, this seems irrational, but underneath it all, perhaps, there's a logic at work where those with money are still making it. And they're trying to, on the one hand, reinvigorate American hegemony. There's a desire to sustain American power, signified in part by the value the U.S. extracts globally, given the power of the dollar as the world's supranational currency. But by many estimates these days are numbered, unless current trends can be reversed. So we see people supporting Trump and now Biden in their against China, but still wanting to make money whenever and wherever they can. And I think that explains this sort of silly contradiction at work.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.